Hi guys, Olive here. Here today to review two books on apples. Apples are globally ubiquitous. They are one of our most celebrated fruits. They are full of symbolism, but they're also full of nutrients. One apple a day is said to keep the doctor away, and in today's video we have not one, but two books on apples to discuss. So by the end of this video, your health is about to be exemplary. The first book I would like to discuss is The Ghost Orchard, The Hidden History of the Apple in North America by Helen Humphreys. This book was published in 2017 by HarperCollins, and my hardcover copy that I purchased with my own money comes in at 256 pages. This is one of those nonfiction books that proves very difficult to categorize into any one subgenre of nonfiction because it's a little bit of this and it's a little bit of that. It has elements of memoir, history, travel writing, food writing, and all of it is tied together with some beautiful language. The author of this book, who is pretty prolific, by the way, she writes both fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. She has released a ton of books. She begins this book by subtly explaining to us the motivation behind it. She talks about the previous year before she started writing this book. She had stayed at this cabin while her closest friend was in the slow process of dying. And right next to this cabin, there was an apple tree that grew white winter pearmains. They're a variety of apple. And they're actually said to be some of the tastiest apples out there because they have a slight taste of pear to them. But the following year, the year that Helen Humphreys decided she would write this book, she visited that cabin again. Only this time, her friend and this apple tree were both dead. And it got her to thinking a lot about death and how tasty those apples once were and what remains of any of us once we're gone. And she tells us toward the beginning of the book that she's the kind of person who gets fixated on a specific topic and then just runs with it. And this time, her topic was apples. Throughout The Ghost Orchard, those white winter pearmains proved to be our central anchoring point. Sometimes we're focused on that specific variety of apple, but more frequently, it's the loss of that specific apple tree that guides the narrative. We start off by learning about the surprising history of apples in North America, how even though they're so important to us here, they're not actually native plants. But as the author explains, after apples were brought here, they very quickly became an important part of North American agriculture. Everyone started growing orchards, even Native Americans. Their so-called Indian orchards grew some of the tastiest varieties, but those same orchards were often weaponized against Native Americans or destroyed in an attempt to get them to move off their land. Humphreys also discusses a Quaker woman by the name of Anne Jessup, who predated Johnny Appleseed by about 50 years. She brought cuttings of her favorite apple trees back with her from England, and she helped spread those new varieties around the U.S. during her extensive travels as a minister. She discusses the history of the USDA Department of Pomology, the department looking at apples, and all the watercolor paintings they did of the myriad varieties of apples so that farmers would know what kinds of apples they were looking at in their own fields. But then she zooms in even closer and gives us mini biographies of the painters who did the watercolor paintings of this book's special apple, that white winter pearmain. In this book, the author travels to try to find any lingering traces of those lost orchards. She meets a descendant of Anne Jessup with whom she becomes unexpectedly friends, but all the while she's thinking about what's been lost. She's thinking about her own grief, the very new loss of her close friend, but also she's still mourning her artist grandfather with whom she was extremely close. She talks about him a lot in this book. I would say this book is simultaneously a celebration of apples, but it's also an elegy on what all we've lost. I can't imagine a more perfect title for this book because so much of it is about what's been lost, what is now extinct, but also it demonstrates that there's power in the memory of what once was. So while it does have a melancholy undertone because it does talk about loss so much, I would actually say that the book is driven a lot more by the author's curiosity. You can feel that she's so interested in these people, these places, these apples. She will make you see apples in a whole different light. She will make you understand that it's something you can hold in your hand right now, but ultimately it will become a memory. This was a gorgeous and completely unexpected read. I did not anticipate all the twists and turns that this one was going to have. I never knew what was coming in the next chapter, but I was totally ready to experience it every time I turned a page. The only reason why I gave this book 4 stars instead of 5 is that those mini biographies of the watercolor painters that I spoke about earlier, those felt a little bit choppy and kind of unnecessary. I can see why she included those. I know she also wanted to incorporate some interludes about her artist grandfather in the book, and she needed that art connection, needed an excuse to talk about art in general. And I see how it was the missing puzzle piece within this book. I just didn't enjoy reading those mini biographies as much as I loved everything else in this book. I didn't think they were really necessary. But that is my only complaint. Otherwise, I thought this book was stunning, beautifully written, a whole emotional experience. I would definitely recommend this one if you are into literary nonfiction or grief memoirs. After I finished The Ghost Orchard, though, I found myself with a craving to learn more about apples themselves, to get to the core of the matter, to learn about them not just as symbolic objects, but as real, edible things. I poked around in a book about orchards, hoping that there would be information in there, but instead I raided that book's bibliography and discovered this next book. Apples by Frank Browning was published in 1998 by North Point Press, which I believe is a now defunct imprint of FSG, and the hardcover copy that I got out from the library comes in at 241 pages. This is another book that doesn't fit very neatly into any one particular subgenre of nonfiction. The author of this book grew up on and then went on to run a family orchard in Kentucky, so apples have always been a really big part of his life. And he is a really big presence throughout this book. He frequently talks about his experiences growing apples, and he talks about how much he loves them, really. Unlike Helen Humphreys, the author of the previous book, Frank Browning doesn't have any one central idea that he structures this book around. Instead, he has many different trains of thought regarding the past, present, and future of the apple that he explores throughout this book. But just like she did, he couples those ideas, those mental journeys, with physical journeys. Everything from going to Kazakhstan to see the mountains where wild apples originated, to dropping in on a traditional French cider maker to get a taste of what Europeans used to drink a lot of in centuries past. This must have been a very early version of what we now refer to as microhistory, or a book about a very specific topic that naturally wanders down different avenues that are somehow related back to the topic at hand. I wouldn't call the previous book, The Ghost Orchard, a microhistory because it's so tightly focused, but this one I would, because each chapter is like its own adventure, like a Mary Roach book is. Each chapter of this book brought up new and unexpected things that I never expected we would delve into, like the earliest chapter of this book that's discussing the apple's history in Kazakhstan. I never expected that we would also get a whole conversation about a Soviet scientist who was interested in that same topic, but then who was targeted in Stalin's purges. I definitely didn't expect that there would be basically a whole chapter about the aesthetic qualities of apples and how pretty apples do so much better on the open market. And tied to that, there's a whole story about how the red delicious apple came to take over the American market, but then how it started to lose some of its market share to other varieties. Frank Browning also speaks to an expert who is tasked with trying to predict what apple varieties in the future will be popular. And since this book was written so long ago, I can tell you that his predictions of what would be the next hot apple varieties in the USA turned out to be scarily accurate. But that brings me to my next point. It's kind of a double-edged sword that I read this book nearly 25 years after publication, and honestly, it's probably more like 30 years since the science in this book was new, since a lot of the dates that he talks about are in the mid-90s. It's good because he's able to talk with a lot of people who have firsthand knowledge about some of the historical topics that he brings up. Like, he's able to talk to someone who knew that Soviet scientist. But then on the other hand, I know that so much of the science in this book, everything from current methods of pest control management to genome sequencing of the apple, I know so much of the science in this book is likely to be outdated. Like, just for example, toward the start of this book, he mentions that it's still up in the air whether or not apples actually originated in Kazakhstan because the genome sequencing hadn't been completed yet. Well, I have read on some very reputable websites that genetic testing, that genome sequencing has since been completed, and it has been confirmed that apples came from Kazakhstan. So things like that, but there is so much science presented in this book, I wouldn't even know where to start looking for updated information, so I ended up having to take a lot of the science with a grain of salt. But that's really the only negative thing I have to say about this book. That's the only thing that kept me from giving the full 5 stars to this book that I wanted to give it, because this was so much fun. It was such an unexpected surprise. I was not expecting to love this book as much as I did. It made me want to kick myself that I don't pick up older books on a more regular basis. As a freelance book reviewer, my eye is always on new releases. I feel like I'm just consumed by new releases so much of the time, but I forget sometimes that there are gems like this in the backlist, and it just takes picking up one to maybe discover a new favorite book. And at times, I felt this book was meant exclusively for me because not only am I obsessed with apples, but also he discusses, like I said, Soviet history in here. And there's a whole section about the creation of my all-time favorite apple, the Jonagold. I can't get over how much I loved the writing in this book, especially when he dips into food writing. Especially right in the introduction of this book. It's some of the best food writing I have ever read, but then also when he discusses the magic and mystery of apples, all they represent, the symbolism of them, it's just breathtaking. And then he tells all these captivating stories. My eyes were glued to the page the entire time I was reading this. I couldn't get enough of this book. I highly enjoyed both of these books. I wouldn't call either one perfect, but I feel like this is my very first 2 books on video where I can recommend both books in equal measure. It's just, I'll recommend them differently because they do different things. The Ghost Orchard is much more an emotional, intellectual, philosophical experience that just so happens to be about apples, whereas Apples is a scientific state of the union about apples themselves. So it kind of depends on what you're looking for if you're interested in choosing one of these books. But I will say, if you're at all interested in reading both, I found through experience that they harmonize beautifully. I am so grateful I read these 2 books so closely together in time because they kind of speak to one another. Like, if you're wondering why, if the White Winter Pearmain apple, the central apple of the Ghost Orchard, if it's so delicious, why can't I go buy one at the supermarket? Apples by Frank Browning will explain that. Helen Humphreys discusses Anne Jessup. Frank Browning discusses Johnny Appleseed. Frank Browning is an American. Helen Humphreys is a Canadian, so you've got 2 North American countries represented. I think these 2 really do make a wonderful pair. The flavors blend nicely, if you will. But those were my thoughts on these 2 fabulous books on apples. If you want to read either of these books, or if you have read them and want to share your thoughts, I would love to hear from you in the comment section below. You can tell me how you liked them apples. If you're interested in picking up copies of either one of these books, there will be links for you in the description box below. They're there for your clicking convenience. Also, in that description box, you'll see something I like to call the further reading section, where I will list some books I think you may like if this topic interests you. Also, at the bottom of that exact same description box, you'll see links to where you can find me all around the internet, including Goodreads and Instagram, the 2 places where I'm the most active, in case you would like to keep up with what I am reading and writing about right now. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a wonderful day. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.